Our focus today is the CV. It's a sort of the foundational document in terms of, what you've been using thus far to talk about your academic world. It's also something that you'll continue to use as you're applying for postdocs, faculty positions, and so forth. It's not the most exciting of documents as a genre, but we'll try to look at ways that it can be meaningful to you, meaningful to your identity, meaningful to how you want to be seen and come across to your future colleagues as faculty members. So the CV is something that you all have. And so it's not something that's going to be a sort of a mystery to you in terms of what it is and what it's made up of. I think what we're going to try to do today is think about it more than just a list or a list of lists, because a list of lists is not a very engaging document. A list of lists covers a lot of information perhaps, but it doesn't have a narrative, doesn't have something to keep you engaged and sort of get a better perspective of who you are. And so there are things that we can try to do with the CV to make sure that it ties together all of your other documents, highlights the things that are most important about you that you want to stand out for the people reading this document, for the search committees, for the PIs, whoever it might be. And so let's think about those sort of the other application materials out there. Let's think about how this fits in to that broad perspective, right? So I think, I see the CV as sitting in the middle of all of these other documents that you have, whether it's your teaching statement or your research statement, the diversity statement sort of in flux right now in terms of how that's seen. But everything in the CV is sort of expanded on in these other documents, and everything in these other documents should be echoed by something in the CV. So there's nothing I should read in a teaching statement, for example, that isn't echoed by something similar in the CV. So in other words, if I only read the CV, I should get all the information I need without having to read these other documents. Now, on top of that, these interconnections exist. On top of that, we have the cover letter, which sort of is a narrative document that draws all these other documents together. But the CV is at the heart of this, right? So whether it's a list of lists or otherwise, you need to make sure that it's connected to these other documents so that you have a cohesive narrative that's out there. Now, if I were to ask you which of these, all of these documents should you be customizing for your applications, I think the majority of you would say, definitely the cover letter. That's what you customize. And you're right. But I also think there's an opportunity to customize a lot of these documents in small but meaningful ways for the different types of positions or schools or opportunities that you might be applying to. Because every change that you can make the document more meaningful to someone who's reading it, right? To someone who's reading perhaps lots of applications that are out there. The other key aspect of why customizing is helpful is that there's a lot of content in these documents, and there can be a lot of pages too, and they add up, right? And so if we have, on average, let's say 14 pages per application, if none of those pages feel connected to an institution or to a faculty member or search committee, then perhaps it's less engaging. But if through small, subtle changes, you can sort of make these documents feel connected, then I think the reader will appreciate that because they will see that your application is sort of relevant to them as the reader of that document. So small, subtle changes that I think we can talk about. Now, the sections of the CV, I'm not sort of going to go through each one of these in a lot of detail because you have sort of all these already as part of where you are right now in your process. I think from the perspective of what about the CV is most you, I would say it's the research, it's your teaching, and it's your service, right? So the three pillars of academic life, research, teaching, and service. In a CV, these are the things where you can be the most you in terms of describing actually things that you've done rather than just a publication or a grant or anything, all of which are really, really important. But the most part of, the most you in a CV are these areas here, the experience areas. What do faculty search committees care about the most as part of looking at a CV? Well, it's hard to know exactly what they're judging, what metrics they're using, but the things that they focus on a lot are sort of the currency of academia, right? So they want to know where you got your PhD. They want to know who your advisor is. They want to know if you have grants and awards and other people have seen your work as being impactful. They want to know that you've published and presented. And they want to know who's going to sort of write a reference, about you, right? These are all things that are important, some of which are outside of your control, right? Who your advisor is or things like that. But those are some of the things that stand out to them. So you're sort of balancing these two elements in your materials, right? You want to make sure that you come across. You also want to make sure that a hiring committee can see the things that they need to see to make sure that they can see you as a sort of an ideal candidate. There are things that you don't always have a lot of control over, right? You can't go back in time. You can't change which undergraduate institution you went to or who your advisor is. You can't, make a thing that you try to publish, get published. If the results didn't work out, that you may not have been published. You can't go back and get awards that you don't have. And that's okay. You can focus on the things that you do have and make sure that those come to the forefront as you are going through this process, right? So do not worry about the things that you cannot control. Focus on the things that you can control. And so some of the things that you can control are making sure that your narrative, the way that you talk about yourself, comes across clearly. You can talk about some of the skills that you use. Skills are not at the forefront of how people talk about themselves in an academic setting, but they are important. They can be meaningful in different ways. You can talk about the impacts of your work, whether that's through publications or grants and honors and awards. You can make sure that the scholar that you want to be comes across in some of these materials. And when it comes to the CV, the thing that perhaps you have the most control over, or the easiest control over, is you have control over the order of these different sections within the CV, how you sort of list things out and how you make sure that you're communicating the priority of those experiences. So as an example, if you're applying to a postdoc where research is the only thing that you'll be doing, then your teaching interest, your teaching experience may drop down in the list of things, or you may not talk about teaching at all. So just making sure that you are sort of prioritizing these different sections here is going to be important. If you're applying for a sort of a research-specific position, obviously research is the section that you're going to talk about the most, and your publications and your presentations want to be there to demonstrate the impact of your research. You're still going to probably be doing some teaching, so teaching will exist. If you're applying for a teaching-focused position where teaching was either the only thing you'd be doing or the primary thing that you'd be doing, then your teaching experience is going to be brought to the forefront here. And things like your research interests, the things that you would like to continue to research, might be taken out because that may not be critical. Fellowships and honors, especially if they are teaching awards, may be brought to the front too, to show the impact of the teaching that you've done. So all of these things can be sort of changed around depending on what it is that you want to prioritize. Now, these were some positions I found on LinkedIn, faculty positions at Penn. And for each of these positions I looked at, they sort of happened to mention the impact of being able to, or the importance of being able to have funded research, to seek funding, to have funding, to create a funded research program, right? And so in that case, if you were creating a CV and changing the order, you might bring up the grants, fellowships, and funding closer to the top, to, if you have those things, to really demonstrate the sort of the impact of your research, right? So because they are looking for someone who has funding, who has the ability to attract future funding. The sooner that you can tell them that, the better that will be. Now, we always say don't judge a book by its cover, but the first page of your CV obviously is something that can be judged when someone's looking at it. And so you want to make sure that your first impressions are going to be the right impressions that you're making as part of what you are getting across. And so this is just a sample sort of, CV is perfectly good here, but it's hard necessarily to know exactly what this person's research specialty is, right? So you can see the dissertation title, but not necessarily know the areas. Now, further down in this CV, they had their areas of research and teaching interests, right? And so some of these are actually more illustrative of their sort of expertise. Now, one of the things that you can do is to make sure that if you're applying for a research-centric role, that your research sort of interest and expertise comes to the forefront, right? So I sort of reworked this CV and I put the research interests above the education, so that the first thing I read is sort of what type of scholar this person is, and then I can see their sort of the degrees and the things that come after that. So I immediately know what type of research they are, right? So that's something that you can sort of think about in terms of structuring that. Here's another one, a PhD in French studies. So we have the dissertation listed here, and then a sort of a paragraph describing that, which is something that can happen, especially in humanities CVs. Again, the research interests come below that. Sometimes I think it's sort of good to start with those because they are sort of a nice broad array of keywords and terms that might get a search committee excited about the nature of the research that they will be doing moving forward. So again, perhaps moving that up to the top so that the first thing I see really illustrates the sort of the nature of this person's research. There's no right or wrong with CVs, or the structure of these things. These are just different approaches to take. Here's a STEM one. So again, the thesis title and the publication titles, they're all going to be somewhat illustrative of the topics, but your thesis title isn't always going to be the most meaningful to a broader audience, right? It was fun when you came up with it, or it was, you sort of had a good time, but it wasn't designed necessarily to help a search committee see the value of your research. So again, making sure that those research interests come out is going to be helpful. Now, these are just some examples from STEM fields. The first one is perhaps what I would say is too much, right? So it's a little bit too narrative in terms of research interests, something that might be part of a cover letter or might be part of a research statement. But these keywords, current research or future interests, especially if you're applying for a postdoc where your future research might be different from your current research, this is going to be a sort of a great way of making sure that those keywords come to the forefront. This is humanities, social sciences areas, right? So same thing, so keywords, perhaps just sort of listed or in a more sort of narrative form, if you like that. So just something to consider to make sure that your research identity comes to the forefront. Now, typically in the CV, everything that you're writing about has happened in the past or is happening right now. So everything looks backwards, except the research interests and the teaching interests, because your interests can be sort of a little bit more forward-looking as well. And there's a benefit to do that when you think about sort of the different ways of customizing this document to a particular role that you might be applying to. So here's a job at Villanova, faculty role here, and they list in this job description the preferences that they have for research areas that candidates might bring. So Black Catholicism, African Christianities, and so on, right? So these are keywords that they're going to be looking for. And so if your research interests can include these, even if that's not exactly how you've defined your research right now, it overlaps in different ways, but perhaps you haven't centered these words as part of that, then you get the opportunity to do that a little bit more in those research interests, right? So research expertise and interests, it sort of combines what you are great at and what you are interested in doing moving forward. You're not going to change the nature of your research just based on this, but you can change how you describe your research to make sure that these keywords overlap. So research interests, combination of things that you can and are doing, also things that you will be doing moving forward. And obviously, you're going to go into more detail about your research interests in your cover letter and in the research statement if they ask one of those. Again, sometimes field specific, sometimes job specific in terms of whether they want that. So overlap between these two types of documents. So after research interests, one of the other sections that you can have is sort of a research experience section. Now, this is an interesting one because there are sort of academic discipline norms that sort of affect whether you might have a research experience section that talks about your own research. In STEM fields, it's very common to talk about your research, the tools that you use, the mechanisms that you research, how you did the research. In the social sciences, broadly, sometimes you don't really get a research experience, but you get a working papers section where you're sort of talking about the research that you're doing right now, your job market papers. In the humanities, you don't always have a research experience at all. In fact, the only research that you actually talk about doing in sort of active ways are research that you might have done as a research assistant for someone else's project. In terms of your own thesis or your own dissertation research, you don't necessarily talk about how you do that research. So these are the norms. And my advice is to sort of follow those norms as much as you can, but also to think about whether there's information that you want to get across about your own research, right? So definitely get advice and feedback from faculty, especially recent faculty, not sort of long-standing professors in their field. Their CVs aren't really designed for the job market. But make sure you're also thinking about how you want to describe your research in ways that might be impactful to the jobs that you're applying to. So these are just examples of the things that you might sort of highlight as part of a research experience section, right? So you might talk about sort of your approaches. Maybe you're doing a mixed methods research, and that's important for the department that you're applying to. Maybe you sort of led a collaborative approach, and that's important for the type of research that you might be doing. Maybe you have a skill that's sort of in demand in terms of a technical skill, and you want to make sure that that comes across in your materials. Maybe you're applying to a teaching focus role, and within your research, you help mentor people within that research setting, demonstrating that even within research, that you are an effective teacher, right? So all of these things can be ways to describe skills that you might highlight. Again, following the academic norms of your discipline, even if those don't always make the most sense. So here's just an example of people describing some of their current work and their current projects. There isn't necessarily a lot of skills here, but I performed a book length analysis and I designed and edited a special issue. These are skills in action. So these are sort of describing some of the skills that this person would bring to a particular role. Here we have research interests that's sort of above the working papers, which is a nice way of doing that. And within the working papers, I construct a novel data set is a skill, right? So that is being illustrated here moving forward. Here's a STEM postdoc. And where are the skills listed for the STEM postdoc? All of the skills, all of these bullet points are skills, right? So this just illustrates the different dynamics of how people describe, their research based on academic field, right? But these are good examples of how to talk about research experience in ways that align with faculty roles. I published, I developed these skills, I designed this study, right? All sort of relevant to the faculty world. Teaching experience, another one of the pillars that you get to talk about within your CV. So if you look at a job description, so this is a teaching focused job here. They are specifically looking for certain skills. They want to be people to teach at different levels. If you can dissect cadavers, that's a particular skill that they would love to know about, because that would put you, near the top of what they're looking for. Definitely, wanting to make sure that you can teach undergraduate and also teach online, right? So these are specific things that they are looking for in your documents to make sure that you would be a good candidate for the role. And so you'd want to echo that as much as possible. Here's a job description, again, a Villanova one, where they're listing some of the courses that might be taught as part of this, right? So teaching responsibilities will likely include cognitive psychology, introduction to psychology. So again, they would like to know that you can teach those or that you want to teach those. And so your documents can echo that in specific ways. So the teaching interests, just like the research interests identify your research identity, your teaching interests can talk about the things that you have taught, the things that you know that they want you to teach, right? They say, we'd love this person to teach introductory psychology, and you're like, I want to teach introductory psychology. But they're also an opportunity to talk about things that you could bring to the role that they may not have, that would be a sort of a specialty from your field that would add to their curriculum, that would add to their sort of their course catalog. So teaching interests, again, look back, but also look forward in terms of identifying what you are trying to get across here, right? So a really good, helpful section to think about and customize for each job that you're applying to. Teaching interests are also going to be then sort of covered in different areas, right? The cover letter is going to be where you also mention the fact that you're excited to teach the courses that they want. The teaching statement is where you describe how you teach some of the things that you are talking about, right? So the sort of the mechanism of your teaching as well. If you look at this sort of sample from a CV, you get a very clear sense that this person has taught a lot as a teaching assistant, and you know what they taught, but you don't really get a sense of how they taught or the approaches that they used to teach, right? So this is a very good sort of a good list of experiences without sort of describing what those experiences entail. So if we go to this next example here, this is a little bit more descriptive, because now it's not just the fact that they're a teaching assistant, but I know it's an upper level course or an introductory course. I know how many students there are. I know what backgrounds those students come from, if they're undergrads or graduates, or if they're majors or non-majors, right? So there's a lot more descriptors here that can help identify the skills that this person brings. And then this one is more than that too, right? So this one goes into some of the approaches that they use to teach, in terms of they co-organize, they team taught it, they use different types of technologies to do this, right? And so it goes into more detail, the who they taught, the how many, the how they taught, the what they taught, right? And so in a teaching experience section, you can cover some of that detail to make sure that your skills and experiences are really illustrated nicely. Again, you're going to go into more detail in the teaching statement. You might sort of mention an example more specifically in the cover letter, but if someone only reads your CV, having some of this information here is going to make sure that they see this teaching experience and the skills that you've used to do that. Honors and awards funding, these are things that are, again, part of the currency of what people are looking for. Some of these are just great to have. Look, this person has a lot of things, right? And so it's just a visual representation of all the impact that you've made as a scholar. Sometimes the awards that you might have aren't necessarily meaningful to other people just by themselves, right? So the George Henriksen Award in 2018 doesn't mean anything to lots of people if it's specific to an institution. And so listing things is great, but if there's meaning behind it, right? So who got it, or how competitive it was, or I don't know, how much money came with it, sometimes you may want to describe those things just to put it into context. Not for everything, because I don't think that's important, but just for those that really help sort of the readers of your material see value in these experiences. Remember, you have more context for all of these things. You know what went into it and what they were for. The reader doesn't necessarily have that information. This may be true, especially if you have come from an international research experience and the awards are different, or they're sort of described differently. You might need to put those into a little bit more context. And obviously, if you have funding, you want to make sure that funding really comes to the forefront. If it's a research award that sort of comes with money, that demonstrates that you have received money before, which illustrates that you might be best positioned to get funding in the future, those are great things to list as well. So these are just examples of how people are listing, right? So it is very much sort of a list here, but you get to prioritize, you could subdivide if you wanted to, depending on category. Always great to have. In the cover letter, as you sort of reflect on that, obviously you want to make sure that anything that sort of jumps out from that list that you want someone to know, that, a really prestigious award in your field is mentioned, because you don't want it to get lost in that list of other awards and honors that you may likely have. Publications, presentations, right? These are key in a CV. They can be hard because if you have a whole bunch of presentations and publications, they create sort of a couple of pages sometimes of things, and it's hard to position that list of presentations or publications in a way that sort of doesn't get in the way of the other sections that you might have. But obviously your goal is to prioritize your publications, especially because those are the things, if you do have them, that are critical to highlight as part of what you're doing. There's lots of different ways to get across. Some of those are going to be discipline specific, but it's key to list the things that you have published. It's key to list the things that you are currently working on in preparation. So long as you identify those things clearly, you want to make sure that people can see that you have things going on right now, even if those things aren't specifically published. In terms of publications and presentations, how you break it down is going to be based on your field, but your journal publications, your conference proceedings, your conference abstracts, works in progress, these might be things that you sort of categories that you use to subdivide that section. And obviously listing the most recent first. Always reverse chronological order throughout the CV is going to be helpful. I would usually have the publication sections near the presentation section. They may be subdivided within them, but those two things go well together because they sort of illustrate the sort of the scholarly impact that you're having. Media coverage is sort of what people say about you, right? So people wrote an article about you, so it's not you writing it, but that also illustrates to a search committee that your research is interesting, or your teaching skills are interesting. So media coverage is a section to have if you featured in Penn Today, or your department did a blog or anything like that. You can certainly list some of those things. And obviously, if your research gets out there in the broader world, it's great to sort of list those things as well. So media coverage isn't a thing that you've published, but it demonstrates sort of the interest and excitement that people can have about your research. In most cases, the things in works in progress need to be very much sort of in progress, right? Sort of they're not just starting things, but they are close to being wrapped up in many cases, just to sort of illustrate that, these are things that could be published moving forward. Again, very discipline specific areas. You might be working on a book manuscript that, takes months to sort of come to fruition, or you might be working on a paper where you're just about to submit it, in the next couple of weeks. Both of those could be potentially in progress. The other thing about publications is that you can mention those within the research experience, right? So you can double up on listing the publications in one area, but you can also summarize those in a research experience. Publish 5 papers, oversaw research that resulted in 2 presentations at national conferences. You're sort of mentioning those things twice to give them a little bit more focus in the CV, sort of connecting within the CV the fact that you have publications, but also demonstrating that those are part of your research experience, the outcomes of the skills that you've used in your research experience. So I'm going to just show you some of these resources here. You would want to go to the Career Services website. You'll find our application materials for the faculty jobs section here. We have each of these sort of categories of materials have their own section that you can take a look at. The PhD Career Training Platform has resources that you can take a look at under their faculty careers section. So this is an online tool specifically for PhDs and postdocs across disciplines. So they have a how to write a CV document here. They have a workbook that you can work through as part of this. So that's going to be a great resource for you to take a look at for additional insight into this. If you are on the humanities and social sciences, Imagine PhD has some sample materials, annotated samples that are going to be helpful. So if you go onto Imagine PhD, click on the job families, you'll see that there's a faculty job family, research focused, teaching focused. And under each of these ones, they have analyzed job description with a tailored CV and a tailored cover letter, right? So you can get a sense of how someone adapted their materials to a job description. And they have a couple of samples for research intensive one and a couple of samples for teaching intensive one. So Imagine PhD, a free resource that you can and should take advantage of as much as possible.